Welcome to the Rollins Museum of Art. I'm Gisela Carbonell, curator here at the Rollins Museum of Art, and we want to thank you for joining us tonight for this lecture titled Silent Protest, looking at art, war, and disability with Dr. Keri Watson. We want to thank our members for your support, and also we want to thank the Thomas P. Johnson Distinguished Visiting Scholars and Artists Program here at Rollins for making this event possible. Tonight's lecture is in conjunction with our exhibition, Silent Protest, Perspectives on War and Disability, which opened this past January. The exhibition and programs are part of a series of events related to the National Endowment of the Arts Big Read for this year. I want to thank Dr. Keri Watson, my co-curator for this exhibition, for proposing the idea for this show and for her knowledge and expertise in art and disability studies. This collaboration between UCF and Rollins has enriched our approach to the selection of works included in the exhibition. I hope you all had a chance to see the show in the first gallery when you came into the museum. And if you haven't, I hope you come back and spend some time with it. This collaboration has also enabled us to think about additional forms of engagement with images and objects that are presented in this exhibition in a new light. Silent Protest invites reflection on themes of war and disability, resilience, beauty, poetry, and art, and a lot more, in a moment when there are conflicts happening in various regions of the world. Our co-curator and guest speaker tonight is Dr. Keri Watson. She's an award-winning curator and the author of Florida's New Deal Parks and Post Office Murals, published this year. She's also the author of Visual and Performing Arts Collaborations in Higher Education, Transdisciplinary Practices, published last year. And This is America, Reviewing the Art of the United States, also published last year. She's also the editor of the Routledge Companion to Art and Disability, published in 2022, an associate professor of art history at the University of Central Florida. She also serves on the board of the College Art Association and the Association of Historians of American Art, and is an editor for Panorama, Journal of the Association of Historians of American Art. Her research has been recognized and supported by a Fulbright Fellowship and grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, Arts Midwest, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Florida Humanities Council, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation, among others. We're very happy to have you tonight, Keri. We will have an opportunity for Q&A after the presentation, so please help me welcome Dr. Keri Watson.
Well, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out this evening, and thank you to Gisela and Anna and David and everyone here at the Rollins Museum for putting this all together. Oh, okay, there we go. So as Israel and Palestine continue to fight for control of the Gaza Strip, the war in Ukraine rages on, and political divisiveness marks much contemporary discourse. Many are left to consider the fate of autonomous nations, the hegemony of autocracy, and the future of democracy. Silent Protest, Perspectives on War and Disability explores the consequences of war, displacement, and trauma on communities and visualizes the courage of those who speak out against injustice. Generously funded by the NEA Big Read, which is an initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. This exhibition features 14 works in sculpture, painting, photography, and lithography drawn from the Rollins Museum of Art's permanent collection, which is amazing. These pieces respond to the themes of Ilya Kaminsky's 2019 book of poetry, Deaf Republic. This book follows a family of puppeteers as they struggle to resist the war that surrounds them. Drawing connections between global and local political conflicts, Deaf Republic weaves a rich allegory of the urgency of collective action in times of oppression. Told in 2 acts, it begins with the shooting of Petya, a deaf boy, by soldiers occupying the fictional village of Vasenka. In response to his murder, the townspeople collectively go deaf, inventing their own sign language and using puppets to resist their oppressors. Each of the artworks selected for this exhibition engages with war or disability in different ways. Several react to the civil unrest of the time of their making. Others were made by artists with disability. Still others take war and disability as their subjects. Taken together, the works on display marshal the lessons of critical disability studies. Disability studies emerged in the 1970s and 1980s alongside disability activism and was driven by the slogan, "Nothing about us without us." The field shifted the emphasis in disability from the medical model, which locates disability in the person and views disability as an individual impairment in need of prevention or cure, to a social model, which situates disability in society, viewing it not as a result of impairment, but of inaccessible environments, societal barriers, and stigmatization. Further developments in disability studies in the past decade have introduced more nuanced models, such as cultural, political, and relational models of disability. These models, advocated by scholars including David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder, Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Tobin Sievers, recognize both the social and material aspects of disability and counter the limitations of the medical social binary. In recent years, critical disability studies, which integrates disability into broader discussions of oppression and highlights the intersections of disability with systems such as patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and racism, has emerged. Silent protest participates in this expanded concept of critical disability studies and demonstrates how art critiques late-stage capitalism, global environmental exploitation, and systemic oppression. War not only causes physical and psychological impairments, but also disproportionately impacts those experiencing disabilities. According to statistics gathered by Human Rights Watch, an estimated 9.7 million people with disabilities are forcibly displaced as a result of conflict and persecution and are victims of human rights violations and conflict-related violence. As noted by the historian Achille Mbembe, globalization is a key component of necropolitics, or the capacity to define who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who is not. Or, as asserted by disability studies scholar Nirmala Aravelis, social marginalization most often occurs at the intersection of ideologies of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability. Theorizing a new disability justice movement that challenges necropolitics and rejects models of disability based in heroic narratives of individual rights, these scholars, like Kaminsky and the artists whose work are on display in silent protest, look to the material conditions of marginalization, such as enslavement and racial capitalism, to conceptualize disability as a systemic issue based in inequitable institutions and hierarchical structures. The artwork featured in silent protest engages with this discourse. And tonight's talk will offer a closer look at the works included in the exhibition to illustrate the power of art to speak truth to power. Art's capacity to amplify marginalized and minoritized voices is announced by Sean Theodore's portrait of Amanda S. Gorman, the National Youth Poet Laureate, who read her poem, "The Hill We Climb," at President Joe Biden's inauguration in 2021. Born in 1998 in Los Angeles, Gorman began writing poetry about race and gender inequality when she was a young girl. Diagnosed with an auditory processing disorder in kindergarten, She has speech articulation issues that make it difficult for her to pronounce certain words and sounds. Despite any impediments caused by this impairment, Gorman went on to graduate from Harvard University and to become the youngest inaugural poet in US history. I want to read just a few verses from The Hill We Climb from the inauguration that relate to this exhibition. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze, not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first. We must put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. And every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Theodore's portrait of Gorman, with its dramatic lighting and powerful use of the silhouette, illustrates the subject's physical and spiritual resistance to systemic oppression. And here it's worth taking a moment to discuss briefly the history of the silhouette. An art form made popular during the 18th and 19th centuries, the silhouette was advocated by Charles Willson Peale, a leading American artist of the colonial and Federalist periods. Peale enslaved Moses Williams, who you see a silhouette of here, a self-portrait, whom he taught to create silhouettes and then employed at his Philadelphia museum to sell them to museum visitors. Though the silhouette fell out of popularity with the invention of photography, the silhouette has been famously revived over the past 30 years by contemporary artist Keri Watson, who uses the simple figure of the silhouette to represent the cultural role of Blackness in the United States. Recreating scenes of Southern minstrelsy and puppetry to capture the heavy horror of slavery, Walker presents hard-to-watch scenes in ways that won't let visitors look away. Theodore engages the silhouette's thorny history as well to create works that explore race, spirituality, patriarchy, matriarchy, and class structure, deconstructing what he calls Afro-mythology. As photography became more common and the silhouette fell out of fashion, photography was, from its inception, employed as a tool for social protest. And this exhibition includes several photographs that draw attention to political issues. Irish artist Richard Moss takes photographs using infrared film, which transforms verdant vegetation into a haunting harbinger of death. Developed by Kodak and the US military for aerial surveillance of war zones, infrared film captures wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation in a rich magenta tone. Green plants, which have more chlorophyll, reflect more infrared energy and translate into deeper magenta hues. Challenging the ontological status of the photograph as a literal translation of the scene before it, Moss uses the medium's falsehoods, the pink hue of anti-camouflage film, to visualize what otherwise remains unrepresentable to the camera. The landscape is beautiful, even as it hides the blood and bodies of war. In this case, Moss's photograph captures two rows of soldiers pausing on the sides of a roadway that bisects the image. Paired in the exhibition with a quote from Kaminsky's book of poetry, quote, "I do not hear gunshots, but watch birds splash over the backyards of the suburbs. How bright is the sky as the avenue spins on its axis? How bright is the sky? Forgive me, how bright." Close quote. The poem and the photograph work together to remind us of the beauty that persists amid trauma. Edged in electric pink, Moss's soldiers appear in silhouette and demand that viewers turn their attention to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where civil unrest, genocide, and war to control the world's largest reserves of rare earth metals has resulted in the death of nearly 6 million people since 1998. In 2019, 12.8 million people, nearly 13% of the estimated population, were in need of humanitarian assistance and protection, particularly in the eastern part of the country, where women, children, and persons with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by war. Not only are civilians with disabilities disproportionately impacted by war, but armed conflict also causes death and disabilities. The Vietnam War, a 20-year proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States, exacted an enormous human toll. Between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were killed, plus 300,000 Cambodians, 50,000 Laotians, and nearly 60,000 US service members. In addition to this immense loss of life, many who survived the war have disabilities. In addition to using infrared film to see into the jungles of Vietnam, the US Air Force used Agent Orange to destroy more than 40% of South Vietnam's vegetation. Called by the United Nations one of the most toxic compounds known to humans, Agent Orange was widely used in Vietnam from 1961 to 1971 as part of the US military's herbicidal warfare program called Operation Ranch Hand. In addition to causing birth defects, and still causing them today in Vietnam, that affect the spinal cord, and the brain, Agent Orange has been linked to 44 types of cancer. Not only devastating the people of Vietnam, Agent Orange has been linked to Parkinson's, Hodgkin's, and leukemia in the United States, with a recent study finding that more than 2/3 of Vietnam veterans have experienced at least one disability attributed to their wartime service, and more than half have experienced 2 or more types of disability. Larry Fink's Washington Moratorium, a black and white image of the November 15, 1969 March on Washington, D.C. to end the war in Vietnam, pictures the Washington Monument rising up from a sea of demonstrators. One protester holds a flag, another raises their fists defiantly as a cloud of tear gas blooms among them. Over 250,000 people attended the first moratorium march in October, a month before this photograph was taken. During that time, people marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, led by Coretta Scott King. In a statement to the press following that march, Nixon said, "Under no circumstances will I be affected, as policy made in the streets equals anarchy." Nixon's response did not, however, lessen the power of the protest, as this first march was followed by a second one in November, captured by Fink, during which 500,000 demonstrators gathered across from the White House for a rally where they were led by Pete Seeger in singing John Lennon's "Give Peace a Chance." His voice above the crowd, Seeger interspersed phrases like, "Are you listening, Nixon? Are you listening, Agnew? Are you listening in the Pentagon?" between the choruses of protesters singing, "All we are saying is give peace a chance." Among those at the moratorium a protest captured by Fink, were Leonard Bernstein, the group Peter, Paul, and Mary, John Denver, Arlo Guthrie, and the Cleveland String Quartet, all of whom played that day for the crowd. Even 4 touring companies did songs from the musical Hair that day at the protest. So in the exhibition here, Fink's photograph is paired with lines, "The deaf don't believe in silence. Silence is the invention of the hearing," a verse Kaminsky uses in his book to define deafness, not in relation to hearing, but rather on its own independent terms. Similarly, the protesters in Fink's photo sing in response to Nixon's abuse of power, defining the war and the role of the US in that war on their own terms. Taking inspiration from the importance of performance in Deaf Republic, several of the works in silent protest depict musicians. Made in the years between the World Wars, The Fiddler, painted by British artist Walter Richard Sykert in 1925, depicts a street musician in a black coat and hat playing a violin. The solitary figure stands against a backdrop of muddy browns, reds, and greens, characteristic of the artist's style during the 1920s, as many artists responded to the First World War by making art that returned to classicism or the return to order, who used representational styles and rejected some of the abstraction of the earlier avant-garde. Also, as in earlier wars, Ukrainian artists too today have turned to music for comfort and connection, filling the streets with sounds as their cities have come under siege by Russian forces. Two photographs in the exhibition by Margaret Burke-White, taken in the Soviet Union a few years after Sykert painted The Fiddler, connect silent protest to the imagined geographical location of Deaf Republic. Burke-White, who made her name as a champion of industry and as a photographer for Fortune magazine, made 3 trips to the USSR between 1930 and 1933 to cover the new nation's rapid industrialization under Joseph Stalin's first 5-year plan. In 1930, she visited eastern Ukraine and southern Russia and photographed the construction of the Dnieper hydroelectric station, the Stalingrad tractor factory, and the Novorossiysk cement plant. Fascinated by technology, she traveled to the southern Ural Mountains in 1931 to cover workers building the largest steel mill in the world. And in the summer of 1932, she returned to the USSR, traveling to Baku and Ukraine to witness the opening of a power plant and of the largest dam in Europe at that time. While there, Burke-White found herself increasingly interested not only in the industrial landscape, but also in the strength and character of the people she encountered. Village School columna captures this fascination, depicting students in a small village school southeast of Moscow. Burke-White arranged the children in a rough triangle that emphasizes their communal solidarity and the austerity of their surroundings. While Burke-White points the camera down at the children, exaggerating their pyramidal arrangement and putting the viewer in the position of the teacher, in another photograph on display, Soviet Serenade of 1931, she shoots up, dramatically foreshortening and heroicizing the street performer. As in Sykert's Fiddler, the viewer is the audience, the musician's accordion looming large as he looks down on us. Burke-White's photographs, among the first images taken by an American in the Soviet Union, were published in Fortune magazine, the New York Times, and her book, Eyes on Russia, which was published by Simon & Schuster in 1931. The 2 photographs included in Silent Protest by Burke-White display what Tobin Siebers termed disability aesthetics and challenge modernity's preference for non-materialist aesthetics that can resist authoritarian and hegemonic politics. Burke-White was in the USSR during the Holodomor, the 1932-33 famine that took the lives of 4 million people in Ukraine. And her increasing sympathy for the Soviet people prompted a similar identification with working class people in the United States, then later in India and South Africa. Over the course of her career, which was cut short by her own diagnosis with Parkinson's disease in 1954, Burke-White consistently used her camera to bring attention to the important social issues of her day, even as her popular front sympathies brought her to the attention of the House Un-American Activities Committee. A surrealist representation of music is found in Eugene Berman's Italian Symphony No. 2 of 1941, a compositional sketch for a proposed staging of Felix Mendelssohn's Symphony No. 4 in A major, commonly called the Italian. The watercolor depicts the theater's proscenium as a bombed-out ruin. Berman, a Jew, fled the Russian Revolution, immigrating to Paris in 1918. He then escaped Paris ahead of the Nazi advance in 1935 and moved to New York, where he showed with the Surrealists at Julian Levy's gallery. As art historian Amy Lyford notes, Surrealist practices emphasized bodily dismemberment in order to critique, or at least question, prevalent ideas about bodily integrity and social progress. Or, as art historian Hal Foster reminds us, it is no secret that surrealism concerns psychic trauma. Influenced by the theories of Sigmund Freud and drawn to the irrational, the fantastic, and the absurd, surrealists often depicted strange landscapes, distorted figures, and symbolic or enigmatic scenes, and Berman is no exception. Here, the surreal stage set visually connects to Kaminsky's poetry. Quote, in a bombed out street, wind moves the lips of a politician on a poster, and what remains of her is a puppet that speaks with fingers. Close quote. Like Seikert's Fiddler and Berkwite's Soviet Serenade, Henry Botkin's 1948 painting Solo, Trumpet Player, captures the power of music to communicate that which often goes unspoken. Existing at the intersection of ideologies of race, class, and disability, and mimicking the chameleon-like aesthetic of the puppets described by Kaminsky in Deaf Republic, the musician is rendered in flat geometric planes. His race is ambiguous, his skin rendered in cool greens and purples. He sits on a low, wide stool, or perhaps a drum, while the musical notes of his profession float around him on a ground of reds and oranges. Hewing closely to Sieber's conception of disability aesthetics, the Cubist rendering asserts the incontestable conclusion that modernist techniques and formal experiments render bodies whose shapes mimic deformation, whose coloration resonates with disease conditions, and whose subject matter takes on explicitly the representation of physically and mentally disabled people. And that's Sieber's talking about disability aesthetics. Born in Boston in 1896, Botkin moved to New York in 1917, where he attended the Art Students League while living with his cousins, the composer George and the lyricist Ira Gershwin. After studying in Paris from 1926 until 1933, Botkin returned to the United States and accompanied the Gershwins on their 1934 trip to Folly Beach, South Carolina, where they went to adapt Du Bois Hayward's 1925 novel into the Tony Award-winning jazz opera Porgy and Bess. Recounting the story of a Black disabled man living in the slums of Charleston who tries to rescue his girlfriend from her violent ex-boyfriend and drug dealer, Porgy and Bess is a meditation on race, class, gender, and disability in America that has enjoyed a long and complicated history. Porgy's portrayal, like that of Botkin's trumpet player, exhibits what disability studies scholar Kerry Sandel terms representational conundrums, or those, quote, challenging, puzzling, or paradoxical issues that are unique to or complicated by disability's presence, close quote. This is the case for both disabled and raced bodies, as Hayward's Black characters epitomized a vision of American race relations congenial to Southern and Northern whites alike. While the Gershwins wrote the opera, Botkin was at work on a series of paintings depicting jazz musicians, and Solo exhibits the artist's engagement with the abstracted figurative painting tradition of the first half of the 20th century, the influence of Porgy and Bess, and conflicting ideologies of race, class, gender, and disability at mid-century. Hanging on the same wall with Berman's Italian Symphony No. 2, Seikert's Fiddler, and Botkin's Solo, and across from Moss's First We Take Manhattan, the title of which was borrowed from a Leonard Cohen song that begins, "They sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. I'm coming now. I'm coming to reward them. First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin." Gene Davis's 1981 lithograph Sonata invites a formal riposte and a lyrical and musical response to war and disability, silence and sound. Davis became an artist as the abstract expressionist movement was taking hold in the United States, and he joined the general trend for deeply personal painterly abstraction. Like other members of what would become known as the Washington Color School, Davis embraced a cool, hard-edged style that used line as its primary formal element. Davis advised viewers to approach his works by singling out one of the colors and allowing their eye to travel from one to the other. This sliding across the canvas, across what he termed its intervals, creates a sense of kaleidoscopic motion that is cinematic. His invocation of the interval also points to his love of music, which he enjoyed for its analytic and mathematical precision, as well as for its expressive potential. Despite its calculated appearance, the stripes in Davis's paintings were not based on the conscious use of theories or formulas. Instead, he often compared himself to a jazz musician who plays by ear, describing his approach to painting as playing by eye. This synthesis of senses is echoed in Deaf Republic, as silent, sight, and sound play important roles. In the book, the country becomes a stage and its citizens the chorus. The characters move constantly from one stage to another, from the public stage of an occupied town in a time of political unrest via a local puppet theater to that of one's own home, from sound to silence and back again. The first act of the play follows Sonia Baravinsky, Lisenska's best puppeteer, her newlywed husband Alfonso, and their soon-to-be-born child Anushka. Together, the Baravinskys lead a rebellion among Vyshensky's people, teaching sign language and arranging silent protests in the town square. In the second act, puppet theater owner Mama Galia takes on the mantle of the rebellion. Poems describe her and her puppeteers teaching signs to townspeople, caring for Anushka, tearing through town on bicycles and kissing on park benches. By night, they lure soldiers one by one to their deaths behind the curtain of the theater. Then arrests begin, and the allyship of the townspeople begins to weaken. As Act Two closes, silence, which functioned initially as a form of rebellion, becomes a failure to act. Poetry and art making as both valid and invalid or invalid responses to the debilitating effects of war are echoed in American artist Robert Andrew Parker's Sunday Dinner for a Soldier, which was inspired by the World War II era poems of battlefield poet Keith Douglas. Douglas's poems recall the bleak reality of a British soldier fighting in the Second World War. On June 6, 1944, Captain Douglas, just aged 24, landed in Normandy. 3 days later, he died. Fatalistic, the young poet had crossed the Channel convinced that he would die, and before his tank regiment, the Sherwood Rangers, left for France, he wrote his poem on a return from Egypt, its prescient final stanza announcing, "The next month then is a window, and with a crash I'll split the glass. Behind it stands one I must kiss, person of love or death, person or wraith, I fear what I shall find." Douglas spared no detail in demonstrating that death and mutilation were bloody and devastating. And mirroring the dark tone of the poem, Parker's print depicts an operating room in a hospital at Camp Lewis in Washington State. The orange and military greens, along with the title, create a particularly morbid scene of surgery and of suffering and of the futility of it all. Monte Ollinger's St. John's Sunset offers a formal counterpoint to Parker's Sunday Dinner for a Soldier, and the two are connected in the gallery by Kaminsky's verse, "Be courageous, we say, but no one is courageous as the sound we do not hear lift the birds off the water." An ambidextrous painter who uses his work to express himself as a form of art therapy, Ollinger was diagnosed with a movement disorder called dystonia, a condition which causes the muscles in his body to contract involuntarily. These contractions cause his body to make repetitive and twisting movements, often keeping him in uncomfortable positions. Ollinger turned to painting to help him process his feelings about this condition and to find comfort in art making. Art therapy, which encourages people to use art as a means of self-expression, emerged as a discipline in the early 20th century when psychiatrists began to exploit the therapeutic potentials of art making. One of the earliest pioneers of art therapy was Adrian Hill, who used art during his own recovery from tuberculosis in the 1930s. During the 40s and 50s, other practitioners, including Florence Kane, used art to help children. In the 60s and 70s, coincident with the adoption of the social model of disability, art therapy became increasingly recognized as a legitimate form of psychotherapy, and formal training programs were established at colleges and universities across the United States and United Kingdom. Today, art therapy is used in a wide range of settings and has been shown to be effective in teaching a variety of physical, cognitive, and psychological impairments. And disability-led arts organizations, such as Healing Arts in Boston, DisArt in Grand Rapids, and Shape Arts in London, work to improve access to culture for disabled people by providing opportunities for disabled artists, training cultural institutions to be more open to disabled artists and patrons, and by running participatory arts and development programs. British Nigerian artist Inka Shonibari has been active with Shape Arts in London since the 90s. When he was 18, he contracted transverse myelitis, an inflammation of the spinal cord, which resulted in the progressive paralysis of his body. Because of his physical impairment, Shonibari is unable to make the work he conceives and instead relies on a team of assistants to bring his artistic visions to life. As he says, quote, I do have a physical disability, and I was determined that the scope of my creativity should not be restricted purely by my physicality. It would be like an architect choosing to build only what he could physically build by his own hands, close quote. Recalling Kaminsky's poem, We Lived Happily During the War, which begins, and when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. Shonibari's 2002 piece, Untitled, offers viewers a peek inside a Victorian dollhouse, a symbol of British colonialism. A miniature representation of a domestic space, Untitled presents viewers with a familiar setting, while also commenting on the impact of war and colonial exploit on everyday life, including domestic interiors and family dynamics. Combining Western and African elements, Shonibari highlights the hybrid nature of post-colonial identity and asks viewers to consider the impact of imperial powers on societies in Africa and beyond. Known for using African fabrics, including Dutch wax print textiles, Shonibari creates interiors dressed in African fabrics, which, like the puppets in Deaf Republic, illustrate the fluidity of identity and the complex interplay of cultural, historical, and social factors on individuals and their families. Helen Van Meen's portrait of environmental activist Greta Thunberg captures the adolescent in a portrait at once elegant and awkward, effectively revealing the dignity and vulnerability of this tender time of life. Recalling a 17th century Dutch painting with its exquisite jewel-like details and glowing light-washed quality, the portrait depicts its subject seated in an accordion-pleated green dress and blue sneakers. It is paired in the gallery with Kaminsky's words, Our silence stands up for us, a reference to the town's communal deafness and to Thunberg's selective mutism, as well as her posture in the photograph. Thunberg says she first heard about climate change in 2011 when she was 8 years old and could not understand why so little was being done about it. The situation depressed her, and as a result, at the age of 11, she stopped talking and stopped eating. Eventually, she was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, and selective mutism. Like Visenska's villagers, she used disability to actively protest oppression, and like the young children in Berkowitz' Kolumna, lined up as Soviet propaganda, Thunberg has staged school strikes for climate to urge her native Sweden to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement. Finally, and you may have noticed I made kind of a loop in the gallery. So finally, Joanka Potte's 2014 sculpture, Abstinentia, Libertad, counters Berkowitz, Berman's, Botkin's, Seikert's, and Davis's depictions of music with adamant silence asking, what does it mean to be heard? Using American Sign Language to defy self-restraint and self-silence, Capote cast the hands of anonymous Cuban laborers in bronze as they formed letters in sign language that can be arranged to spell out politica, religion, economia, democracia, and libertad, challenging viewers to recognize and appreciate multiple different languages, ASL, English, Spanish, and to hear the voices of those silenced by racism, classism, ableism, and necropolitics. Capote's work interrogates power and politics and addresses the international refugee crisis and the suppression of civil liberties. Capote's depictions of the hands of immigrants gesture to the weight of silence and the power and potential of disability to act as more than metaphor. The works on display in Silent Protest focus on the power of visual art, an intrinsically quiet medium, to respond to the catastrophic effects of war and the systemic marginalization of people with disabilities. Engaging with political violence, disability, resistance, resilience, and the power of language, and inspired by Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic, this exhibition explores the consequences of war and necropolitics, while also visualizing the courage of those who speak out against injustice. Engaging with the complexities of embodiment, this exhibition, like critical disability studies, recognizes both the social and material aspects of disability, inserting disability into broader discussions of war and oppression, patriarchy and capitalism, colonialism and racism. And because this exhibition is inspired by this book of poetry, I would like to give the poet the last word and read the final poem in this collection. It's titled In a Time of Peace. Inhabitant of Earth for 40-something years, I once found myself in a peaceful country. I watched neighbors open their phones to watch a cop demanding a man's driver's license. When the man reaches for his wallet, the cop shoots into the car window. Shoots. It is a peaceful country. We pocket our phones and go to the dentist, to pick up the kids from school, to buy shampoo and basil. Ours is a country in which a boy shot by police lies on the pavement for hours. We see in his open mouth the nakedness of the whole nation. We watch, others watch. The body of a boy lies on the pavement exactly like the body of a boy. It is a peaceful country, and it clips our citizens' bodies effortlessly, the way the president's wife trims her toenails. All of us still have to do the hard work of dentist appointments, of remembering to make a summer salad, basil, tomatoes. It is a joy, tomatoes. Add a little salt. This is a time of peace. I do not hear gunshots, but watch birds splash over the backyards of the suburbs. How bright is the sky as the avenue spins on its axis? How bright is the sky? Forgive me, how bright. Okay, well, I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
And Parker Sunday dinner over 71 was based on it. Yes, a suite of prints finished by different artists that were responding to the poetry of Pete Douglas, who was a World War II soldier in film and action. But who wrote her poetry before he died in war. Thank you. You're welcome. Wow, that is a very good question. Yes, I can. So she asked, really, like, can an art exhibit do anything to actually have change, I think, right? How does art respond to war? How has art been used to respond to war? And does it make a difference? I would like to think that it does. But I think the
the poetry also is art, is the book is engaging with that, right? And also this idea that there's still beauty, right? That even as someone is dying, someone is getting married, right? Someone is being born. If the worst moment in your life is the best moment in someone else's life, right? That is this thing we're all brought together in. And so I think sometimes art and exhibits are about sad and hard and difficult things. I don't want to tear it up. And sometimes they're about beauty and aesthetics. And I think, for me, I think that this show, Sound of Chance, I hope, will be for people a quiet, small show, but that it can encourage these conversations, right? And I do think that art exhibits are probably, and art in general, most powerful at responding to things when it is not overly propagandistic, right? Or too political. Because I think that we all enjoy a little more subtlety and nuance in life. And maybe a way to respond to the bombastic nature of war is with something more quiet or more beautiful. Thank you. Other tear-jerking questions?
Yeah, I was just ask you if you can talk a little bit from your perspective about the process for putting this exhibition together, because obviously you've done a lot of work with disability studies before, you've curated exhibitions and worked on these topics, but you're putting it all together here and curating an exhibition that is not the traditional way of doing it by including quotes inspired by a book, includes text, and works of art, and this idea of communication and silence and language at the same time. You can share, I don't know, a few things about your experience.
Yeah, sure. Well, I love the Big Read. I love any Big Read. I think it's a fantastic program. You know, I think 25 years ago, the National Endowment did a survey of Americans and found that the number of people who were reading for pleasure and who were reading for literature had dramatically declined. And it's funny, a lot of people ask me, because I'm a historian, I'm an English professor, I'm not in the English department, and so the first big read I wrote was for Jordan Christian's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I think the second one was Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I do work on the 30s, usually I'm a big fan of the Great Depression. Well, because again, I guess because I'm also the National Endowment there, right? This is this decade that we feel where we have unprecedented federal support for the arts, and the arts become really part of everyday life in the United States. But anyway, I think that one of the reasons I so enjoy the Big Read is because I'm not, and I think we've done 7 or 8 of them. I think we're also successful in getting the grant because it's not an English department, and it's not just going to be, we're going to bring the poet, we're going to write papers, and we're going to read it into a book club. We do all those things. We have book clubs at all of the public libraries. We do book clubs in the prison. We do book clubs with anybody who wants to do a book club. We order a lot of books, we give the books away, and it is trying to get everybody excited about reading. But it's also have an art exhibition. We're doing a theatrical adaptation, a devised piece based on this book of poetry as well at UCF Celebrates the Arts. And we're bringing Ilya Kaminsky to do a poetry reading and a book signing. And so those are all really great things. But I think that when there will be people who will come and see this exhibit and maybe won't even have this book, right? They will maybe engage with it, but they will have the quotes, and maybe that will inspire them to think about it. And to see the art responds in a different way. So I'd like to bring in all of the kind of different disciplines of the arts and humanities to respond to the themes of the novel. And reading this was a joy because we got to work together, and you have such an amazing collection here at the Rollins Museum of Art. So, you know, sometimes when you curate a show, you are borrowing lots of institutions, and that's one thing, right? Then you think about what do I want? Right, and this is what do we have and what can we pull, and I really actually appreciate that the same way I enjoy going with the stacks in the library and kind of browsing and the serendipity of what you might find, and then being forced to draw connections and to think about how you can make conversations. Whereas if you're picking whatever you want, then you almost already have like your thesis in mind before you do your research, right? It was a real joy and pleasure. And you know the collection so well that I was just able to say, well, I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about this, and could say, well, what do you think of this? And then, yes, there, you know. And I'm sure there's still a few that was like, yeah, but yeah. Did I answer your question? Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.